Hello, everyone. Welcome to our ClimeCo webinar, Carbon Quality in Context, the Value of Balance in a Carbon Offset Portfolio. This presentation was originally given at NACW about a month ago, but we figured it was so great that we'd have it happen again. So here are our wonderful presenters. We have Derek Six, the Chief Operating Officer here at ClimeCo. Many of you are probably familiar with him. Then we have Clive Welham, our Vice President for NatureBased Solutions at ClimeCo, and Lauren Mechak, our Senior Director for Asset Innovations. Let me just make sure that everyone is admitted at this time. It looks like people are still trickling in a little bit. So why don't I allow Derek, Clive, and Lauren to kind of say anything they'd like to say before we get started. And that way we can kind of let people come in one by one here. So
I still see people trickling in, Dustin. So
maybe just one by one. Yep. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get started on this topic?
Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah. All right. I see we have over 30 that have joined, so we can probably get started. If Lauren would like to get the first slide going. I also wanted to point out that we will be taking Q&A questions throughout the presentation. So there's a Q&A button at the top of the screen. And if you have any questions, please feel free to share them. And then hopefully there'll be enough time at the end to answer them all. So everyone who's in the webinar right now, feel free to do that. And we'll get started. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, Dustin. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar, Carbon Quality in Context. I really appreciate your participation today. My name is Derek Six. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of ClimeCo. As a global leader in carbon offset project development, ClimeCo recognizes we have a responsibility to discuss our views on quality of offset projects and to advocate for continuous improvement. I was thinking back and, I began my offset project development career 17 years ago. And during that time in the markets, I've seen tremendous progress. I've seen updated registry rules. I've seen frequent protocol revisions. We've seen improvements to verification processes, to tracking of offsets and serialization of credits. And we've seen tremendous improvements to transparency. I think the one thing that I haven't seen change is our view on the critical importance of offsets. 17 years later down the road in my career, we still live in an extremely emissions-intensive society. Voluntary offset projects provide incentives for innovation. They provide for engagement of diverse stakeholders. They bring technologies to scale, and they cause durable practice change. I was reflecting on something that you may hear about a little bit later in the presentation, some articles over the past year that have said that it's perhaps possible that a ton isn't a ton when we're talking about carbon offsets. I agree and I disagree. I think a ton is not a ton. I think it's so much more. Offset projects are vital for our progress. As we go through this presentation, Lauren and Clive are going to talk a little bit about kind of carbon offset background. And by that, I think we mean a little bit of a primer, a little bit of a foundational description of what the offset market is and how it works. Talk a little bit about trends and current events, some of the articles that I'm referencing, some of the questions around the quality of offset projects. And then Clive and Lauren have kind of unique perspectives on this. Clive is an expert in nature-based solutions and has dedicated much of his career to forestry-based projects. Lauren is an expert at ClimeCo in industrial projects. And so they come both with a passion for offset projects, but they're going to talk a little bit from their perspectives of what is an industrial project, what's a nature-based project, and then why each is valuable. And then I will come back later and kind of sum up. And we hope that there's a lot of time for questions and answers. Please please put your questions in the Q&A section. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much. Oh, I almost forgot. This first part is my part. Just a very brief description of who is ClimeCo. So on the next slide, Lauren, ClimeCo has tried to provide its customers and clients with a really comprehensive suite of services. We address environmental market challenges with market-based solutions. So we have a great ESG advisory team that does not just ESG consulting, but helps regulated entities across the globe with their policy advisory work. We have an environmental credits and transactions team that transacts the voluntary offset credits that we're discussing today, but also a wide range of other products such as plastic credits, renewable energy certificates, water quality credits, a whole host of things that can be addressed with environmental markets. And the project development team, who you're hearing from today, develops offset projects across the globe, industrial and nature-based projects, many different types of protocol and project types. And I think what I'm also very proud of is they help author many new protocols and methodologies for offset projects, as well as being involved in countless stakeholder groups to, discuss revisions to protocols and revisions to registry rules. So I think that they're making a really nice contribution to the overall market and kind of the continuous improvement of the market. Lauren?
Great, thank you, Derek. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a background in the carbon offsets in general. So what is an offset, as well as a bit of history on the market. So starting out, what even is a carbon offset? These days, a lot of people have different definitions, but just so we can level set for the purpose of this presentation, we're defining it as a commodity that represents 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So it might be a different greenhouse gas, it could be nitrous oxide, it could be some of the very high polluting ODS, but they're all moved into CO2 equivalency. The offsets can be purchased, traded, or retired on behalf of a company's emissions, so they're fungible. And as I mentioned, they are put into CO2 equivalent for uniformity. And once we get into just what an offset is, there's also a question of what is quality. So there's certain quality criteria that the market accepts, and we're going to go into a lot of those criteria in this presentation, but just as a basis, we like to say that they're only counted once, so you can't have more than one party claim those carbon offsets. The activities are above and beyond business as usual, so you can't get credit for something that would have happened without the incentive, and that's a term called additionality. They have to be durable or permanent, so while there's some discourse about that in the market, generally we feel that it has to last for at least 100 years or have some sense of long-term protection of that carbon. And it's verified against a rigorous standard created by nonprofit registries. Now, as Derek alluded to at the beginning, we believe that carbon offsets are a very important climate solution. There's lots of different project types and activities that have great climate benefits, but they lack the incentives. So either you can't reduce those emissions without any financial incentives, or for something like a nature-based solution where you're planting trees, there's no incentives to do so. And the carbon market is really excellent in this space because it creates that financial incentive when none exists. Fundamentally, there's several parties involved in the transaction. There's the offset seller, who might be a company, it might be a landholder, and as I mentioned, they have no incentives. They typically work with a project developer like ClimeCo that's able to secure capital for that event, manage the third-party monitoring, reporting, and verification cycle, again, to ensure high quality and make sure that the product that the offset seller is producing will sell in the market. We'll also sell those credits to an offset buyer. So this is a company that may not have direct abatement opportunities, and they are hopefully also reducing internally and doing their very best, but there's always some amount of emissions that today is impossible to address. And through this relationship, the finance is funneled from the buyer back to the seller so they can recover their investment and continue to reduce their emissions. Now, the market has grown a lot in the last few years, but what we wanted to highlight here is that the market's actually been around for a long time. As Derek mentioned, there's some folks that have had very long careers in this space. You can sort of argue over when the first carbon offset was created, but oftentimes people think of the real market formulation occurring with the Kyoto Protocol in the late 1990s. I'm not going to go through every single event in this chart, but as you can see over time, there's been lots of events that have helped bolster the market, such as the Kyoto Protocol actually entering into force, some of the big registries that we're using today still being founded, as well as compliance programs like the California Cap and Trade entering the market. But there's also been some hiccups. In the late 2000s, there was a failure of a bill that was supposed to enable a national cap and trade market in the US that probably would have bolstered the market. There was some early exchanges that ultimately shut down, including the CCX, sorry. And then today we're facing a somewhat unique situation. We've seen huge amounts of market growth, but with that has also come market criticism. And I think that's a good sign for the health of the market, but it also means we need to be really clear about how we're defining quality as new players enter, as the market grows, and it moves into something from maybe a smaller market to really something that's receiving a lot of attention from investors, from institutions, large companies, and even regulators in some case. This is the basis of the standards that we use today in many of the large registries. So they're all based on a high-level accounting standard, ISO 14064, and GHG protocol. And these are the same standards used for many companies that make their GHG footprint. That's important because that means that the offsets have equivalent accounting metrics as those offsetting their emissions. There's also, under that, a set of additional standards set by individual programs. So Climate Action Reserve, VERA, American Carbon Registry are probably familiar bodies to you all. They use these standards, GHG protocol and the ISO, to set their programmatic rules, which are even more detailed. And then, because individual projects also have nuances and important standards that they need to keep in place, they have individual project level methodologies. So a project follows a methodology which follows the accounting standard or registry, which follows the overall standard. So all this to say, there is a lot of standardization already in the market, including additional governance and safeguards throughout. There's public consultations to make sure that you and I have an opportunity to provide feedback. There's expert working groups to make sure that those key topics that require nuanced discussion can occur. Third-party verification, conflict of interest. I could go on, but there are a lot of safeguards already in place. And all this to say is that the market's perfect and it has no problems. Just kidding. With that, I'm going to transfer it over to Clive, who can chat about some of the trends today, some of the criticisms we face, and the importance of its continuous improvement.
Thanks, Lauren.
Over to you, Clive.
Thank you. So the title of our presentation is the value of harmonized carbon offsets. And part of that harmonization process really relates to the idea of a job well done. And so what that means is that we need to ensure that our projects are developed to the highest standard. And to do that, we need to be aware of what some of the criticisms and issues have been and that we're seeing in the mainstream medium these days around these types of projects. Otherwise, we have no standard by which to ensure that we're delivering our projects to the highest possible standard that they can. So what I've done here is assembled a number of criticisms and issues that I've seen in the mainstream media of late, and I'm just going to briefly review them, and then we'll return to them later when we talk about the projects that we've invested in at ClimeCo and how we try to address these issues with our projects to ensure their quality. There are three groups here of essentially what I consider to be the core issues. I've grouped them into process, delivery, and obstacles. I won't go through the list right at this moment, but what I've done here is give you an indication that there has been a fairly extensive set of criticisms attached to these projects. Some of them are valid and some are useful to us in terms of improvement, others perhaps less so. But what I'm going to do now is go through in a little bit of detail so you clearly understand what our position is with regard to these issues and how we might address them going forward. So let's start with the process box. Lauren? Thank you. Now, I focused on this in more detail than the other two boxes, and that's because it's the process that's received the most attention in the mainstream media. You might think, for example, of the articles in The Guardian and in Bloomberg, where these kinds of ideas have been mostly developed. Really, there are four main issues. There's one of baseline determination. One of the problems here is that these baselines are not consistent among standards. So one often hears that there are different standards available to develop projects. Each standard has its somewhat different way of calculating the baseline. As a consequence, there's some confusion around which represents the best baseline or which is the most valid. In association with that are accusations of gaming, that baselines have been manipulated such that they render the activities within the baseline as generating much worse removals, much worse removals or higher emissions than would necessarily be the case. What this does then is introduces an issue of counterfactual credibility. So for certain projects, it's necessary to create an argument for what would have happened had the project not been implemented. It's counterfactual in the sense that we can never actually prove that that was in fact the case. And so some issues have been addressed with regard to how credible these arguments have been that are put forward with regard to the baseline. And then finally, there are disputed applications of how baselines are calculated. One that you typically see is what's called a reference area selection, where we take an area that is deemed to be analogous to the project area, and the activities that occur on the reference area are then used as a reference back to determine the positive benefits for the project. That can be a problem to resolve because it's never clear that the reference area represents the true analogy. Another issue with process is the second box, it's leakage. Leakage refers to what happens in terms of additional activities that are outside of the project, but which are caused by the project activity. There are typically two types, activity shifting and market leakage. With activity shifting leakage, what we're referring to here is, say, a project participant or a proponent who implements a project on one component of their land area that they control, and it may be, say, a reduction in harvesting, and then they simply transfer that activity to other areas that they have control over. So it's a shift in activity. The net result is that the project doesn't deliver the benefits that it purports to. Market leakage is a little different. It refers to the impact of, say, removing timber from the marketplace in a conservation project and its impact on market pricing, which therefore might generate incentives for other actors to then enter the market and increase their logging activities, once again, reducing the impact of the project. So leakage overall then is both conceptually challenging and technically challenging. Another issue one sometimes hears about are buffer pools. So the buffer pool represents, in a sense, an insurance against unplanned reversals from a given project. The idea is that when those reversals occur, there is a residual of credits that are not issued to a project, which are then drawn upon and canceled to replace the unplanned reversals from the project itself. There are some issues with the way that buffer pools are calculated. The contribution algorithms, so in other words, how much a given project contributes to the pool, often relies on a legacy approach. What that means is that we look back in time to try to determine, for example, what a disturbance frequency might be, say, in the case of fire. And from that legacy approach, from the historical analysis, we make an assessment of what the risk is of a fire going forward, which constitutes an unplanned reversal. The issue here is that with climate change, what we're seeing is that our legacy approach is not a good predictor of future activities or future risks. So that's a problem that we need to address. And then we have other issues like factor independence. Fires are correlated with droughts. Droughts are correlated with insect outbreaks. So those three factors are often treated independently in assessing our contribution to buffer pools, when the reality is that they're independent. And finally, grievance mechanisms have been highlighted in the mainstream media. Things like accessibility to the standards to process any complaints that local or Indigenous peoples might have with respect to how the project's been implemented. Transparency is another issue. It's difficult to find where those grievances are registered and logged and how they were resolved. So a clearly defined process is something that's been deemed to be needed. Independence is important. Do standards have independent teams or individuals to handle those grievances, to ensure that they're adequate and ensure that the safeguards are in place so that grievances are handled accordingly? So these are essentially some of the major issues that have been identified in the mainstream media under process. If you go to the next slide, please, Lauren, we'll just talk briefly about delivery and obstacles. Delivery refers to value transfer. So how do the benefits of a project that the proponent realizes, how are those transferred to the local and Indigenous people who are affected by the project? That's often been criticized due to, for example, payment schedule. Sometimes there's a delay based in part on when the carbon credits are generated from the project and then sold. And as a consequence, some of the local and Indigenous peoples may not receive the benefits that they originally thought they were, or at least on a schedule that was agreed to. So contract terms then, in terms of, say, the upside potential on a project. And what that means is, if the carbon credit prices go up over time, are there provisions in place for local and Indigenous peoples to benefit from that? And that hasn't always been the case. Under obstacles, we have things like free, prior, and informed consent. Not all projects have actually achieved that, or that's sought or have mechanisms in place to achieve EPIC. The chain of authority needs to be understood. Different traditions and cultures are in practice and in place, wherein individuals who have different authority need to be engaged in the project. And we often in the West don't understand how these kinds of chains of interaction occur. Land use rights and tenure are another issue. We tend to be used to having well-documented ownership rights, and often in many countries that's not the case. Knowledge deficits and communication are two other issues. There's clearly a lack of understanding amongst non-technical individuals about how these projects set up. We need to do a better job of convincing, or at the very least conveying information to the general public, to the mainstream media, and certainly to local peoples regarding what they can expect from a project. To do that, language and dialects are very important. It's our partnership at ClimeCo, our partnerships always include individuals with the ability to communicate in the local language. And finally, there's some basic infrastructure problems that we typically don't consider in the West. Things like identification, who lives where, who owns what, and do they have an ability to receive the value that we transfer through our delivery methods. Often we find that local people simply don't have bank accounts, and perhaps they don't always trade in cash. They might trade in other goods and services. So you can see that the obstacles are quite complex, but nevertheless, they're important for us to engage in and to try to understand when we develop our projects. And we invest a lot of time at ClimeCo trying to make sure that these three boxes are checked off accordingly. I'll give you some examples of that in a few minutes. Next slide, please, Lauren. So we're not the only ones trying to resolve these issues. We have other organizations such as the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. They're developing a set of core carbon principles that essentially at this stage cover three main topics: governance, emissions impact, and sustainable development. Those principles are designed to help the standards themselves improve their approach, so that translates then into project developers who can then improve the standards and the principles by which they drive their projects. And then on the right side, you'll see there are some new rating bodies that have come into existence in the very recently. What these companies do is they actually rate projects based on a set of criteria. Each company has slightly different criteria, but it's valuable for both the project developer as well as the buyers of offset credits to try to see what they're actually buying in terms of perhaps quality of each project. And we consider these ratings, as developers, we consider these ratings important. It helps us ensure that the standards and practices that we employ are consistent and also recognized and appreciated by these ratings bodies. I'll pass it back to you, Lauren.
Great. So now that we've highlighted the background and the current trends today, we're going to give a couple examples of projects that we view as high quality, talk about why we view their high quality, and then also why buyers may or may not be interested in those project types. So we'll go over two different categories of projects. So the first is industrial or technology based. So these are typically at locations like industrial facilities. It might also include things like, standalone direct air capture. And then, so I'm going to discuss those, and then Clive will discuss some of our nature-based projects. So starting with industrial, I'm going to talk a bit about our N2O abatement projects. So just a little background on the importance of this type of project. N2O is a byproduct of nitric acid production, as well as a few other types of industrial activities. And it's a very potent greenhouse gas. I think many people have heard about the impact of methane as a greenhouse gas. It's about 30 times more potent than CO2. N2O is about 265 or nearly 300 times more potent than CO2. And there's lots of gases like this that are highly impactful to the environment. And today, equipment does exist to abate N2O at nitric acid facilities as well as other facilities. But in the US, those facilities are not federally required to abate N2O emissions. They're not typically at the state level either. And they don't really have any incentives or any reason to install this equipment other than for some kind of financial incentive, such as carbon offsets. So what we do with our N2O type projects is, as I mentioned, there's no existing incentives. So we create that incentive structure. We help install specialized equipment that contains either catalyst or high heat to decompose N2O into N2 and O2. And as many of you know, N2 and O2 are actually very harmless and represent 99% of our atmosphere. So there's no negative environmental impacts of that type of effort. And the concentrations before and after abatement are continuously measured using specialized equipment. Those data are compiled and reported every minute, and the equipment is calibrated quarterly and sometimes every single day for accuracy. So we're able to get a very clear picture of the amount of emissions that go into the equipment and the amount of emissions that come out. So it's quantified in a very rigorous manner. And there's lots of different technology type projects. Some may have heard of direct air capture, which actually removes CO2 directly from the atmosphere. That CO2 may also be stored. So related is carbon capture, utilization, and storage that can pull CO2 from different types of facilities. It could be DAC, and then it's stored geologically or used in a product where it is stored long-term. There's low carbon cement type activities, which ClimeCo is also helping enable, which could increase different products that will replace Portland cement, which is highly emissive in the market. We participate in projects that destroy ozone depleting substances, which are, as I mentioned earlier, some of those most extremely impactful greenhouse gases, and they can only be destroyed using very specialized equipment. And there's lots of other technology-based project types in the market today. So why would someone want this type of project? When we talk to our buyers, typically they're very excited about the measurability. There's no concern about whether once the N2O is broken up, it's gone forever. It also supports innovation for climate technology, which can be really exciting, especially for companies that want to make an investment to help transition our economy into the next stage where we have deep decarbonization. But buyers also might want different project types for different reasons. From a co-benefit perspective, when we think about helping the local community or biodiversity, these projects tend not to impact those as directly. They don't positively or negatively impact. A lot of the companies we work with do have very great work they do with the community, but the actual offset project doesn't have, direct relevance there. And the type of reduction as well. These are typically avoidance type reductions. As I mentioned, there are removal types under direct air capture, but for the most part, we're talking avoidance for this project type. And with that, I will turn it back over to Clive, and he will discuss some of our nature-based projects.
Thanks, Lauren. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to highlight two different projects. One is in the lower Mississippi River Basin, and it's a reforestation project that's occurring in one of the most ecologically degraded areas in the US. My second example will be the Kodiak Island project in Alaska. It's a very different project. It's a conservation project in a critically important ecosystem. Next slide, please, Lauren. This is a very pleasing picture to look at. This is our lower Mississippi River Basin project. What you're looking at here is a bald cypress forest, and you'll notice a heron sitting on a branch. Very characteristic of nature-based projects. They're very appealing. They tend to have a very holistic impact. So as Lauren indicated, there's more going on here than just simply carbon removals or avoided emissions. And in fact, when I look at this, I see this a little differently. This picture, what I see is a million different direct air capture activities occurring and through the mechanism of photosynthesis. So really what's happening is these leaves are actually taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I highlight that just to indicate the idea that these projects, nature-based projects, are not fundamentally different than the industrial-based projects. It's just that they have a series of co-benefits that go with them. Now, for some of our clients, that's very appealing. It's the co-benefits that actually drive their investment to a project, and we use carbon to actually finance that investment. So that's a theme that I think that's worth considering, is just how rich the narrative is that we can tell around our nature-based projects. And so I'm going to give you some examples of that now. Go to the next slide, please, Lauren. So we're interested in bottomland hardwood forests. They had traditionally a very widespread distribution along rivers and streams in the lower Midwest and all the way up the coastal regions almost to Maine, so from Texas to Maine. Very important ecosystem, but highly degraded, unfortunately. Next slide, please, Lauren. So the map on the right that you see is the watershed associated with the Mississippi River Basin. And the light blue area is the lower Mississippi Basin. That's where our project area is located. So this is the third largest watershed on Earth. It provides 60% of all the fresh water that flows into the Gulf of Mexico. And the area is historically known for its bald cypress forest in these bottomland hardwood areas. But they've been lost over the decades due to land conversion, logging, and hurricanes. And so the result is it's one of the most ecologically degraded areas in the US. Next slide, please, Lauren. Now, besides the loss of the hardwood forest, there are other species of importance here. So this is where we begin to expand the narrative around these projects. This is an ivory-billed woodpecker. It's the largest woodpecker in the United States and one of the largest in the world. And it inhabits these bottomland hardwood forests. It's highly unlikely you've seen one because they're extremely rare and it's probable that they're actually extinct. So this is unfortunately, a negative side effect of the way we've managed these hardwood forests over the years. But without the presence of these forests, this species cannot exist. Next slide, please, Lauren. There are a host of other species too, for which these forests are important. I won't list them all here, but each species occupies different regions around the forest, depending on where they are in relation to the Gulf Coast. The point here is that these are integral keystone communities, that the trees are the keystone species that support a broad range of these other kinds of organisms that depend on them for their survival. Next slide, please, Lauren. Partnerships are important to us at ClimeCo. We can't do our jobs without them, and we invest a considerable amount of time and effort in developing our partnerships and making sure that our partners are in alignment with our goals and objectives. We work with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, which is the state agency that's responsible for managing, protecting Louisiana's natural resources. So they provide the land for reforestation, which is what we need. They also are active in freshwater diversion into degraded wetlands and in monitoring oversight. So some of the loss in these bald cypress forests is due to drainage. We need to restore some of that. So all of the planting acreage then in this particular reforestation project is within state-owned wildlife management areas. Next slide, Lauren. We have another essential partner here, and that's the Restore the Earth Foundation. So we formed a strategic partnership with REF in early 2020. Their goal is to restore 1 million acres of deforested marshland in the Mississippi River Basin. If they're successful, it's going to result in many hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 that's sequestered in those regenerative forests. And there are lots of co-benefits associated with them, besides the organisms that I've shown you that are directly impacted by these forests. The other co-benefits are storm buffering, general habitat restoration, and shore stabilization. Next slide. Here's one of our study areas. It's the Salvador Wildlife Management Area. It's located just southwest of New Orleans. And what we're employing here is the Vera forestation, reforestation, and revegetation methodology. Our total build out when the project is complete will be upwards of 18,000 plus acres. So it will be substantial in size. Next slide, please, Lauren. Now, to conduct that, we need to ensure that our logistics are in place. The first thing we need is a source of seedlings. And so working with and ensuring that our nurseries are in place and can deliver seedlings in sufficient quantity for timely planting is critically important to the success of any reforestation project. Generally, in any year, the planting window is relatively narrow, and it's important to have a source of healthy seedlings to make sure that planting is successful. And so that's what you're seeing here. Once we have that, next slide, please, Lauren. Once we have the seedlings and once they're at sufficient size, they have to be transported into the field. As I mentioned, these are bottomland hardwood forests and they occupy very wet organic soils. These soils typically are flooded for at least part of the year. So it requires some specialized equipment and a considerable amount of human resources to make sure that we can reach our planting objectives in any given year, as you can see here. Next slide. But it's a mucky exercise. These are very wetland systems and it's difficult to move around. We use the equipment to move our seedlings en masse, but ultimately at the end of the day, it requires a human to actually put them in the ground and make sure they're planted appropriately. So planting logistics is a critical component in the success of any regeneration project, and we spend a lot of time and effort making sure that we can satisfy those logistics. Next slide, please, Lauren. In addition to the simple benefits associated with carbon capture, what we're also looking to do is to capitalize on all the other benefits that we'd like to see this project generate. We're therefore applying for climate, community, and biodiversity standards. It's a certification program that you can essentially do to categorize and receive some recognition for all the additional benefits that come with the project. In this case, there's a listing on the Venn diagram of the community benefits, and then on the right side are some of the biodiversity benefits, and then in the middle are the overlap between those two. And so what we're looking for is to try to achieve a gold level for biodiversity on this project. So again, I want to emphasize that for us, the narrative is just as important as what we can derive from a project in terms of its carbon benefits. And we put a lot of effort at ClimeCo into making sure that we have partnerships in place that will help us achieve those goals. Next slide. Here's another project. This is very different. This is an avoided conservation or this is a conservation project. It's an avoided harvesting play. It's the Afognak Forest Carbon Project. Next slide, please, Lauren. So it's located on Afognak Island in Alaska. The island is in the Kodiak archipelago. It's about 5 kilometers north of Kodiak Island, which is the main island in this archipelago. And it's got a land area of about 1,800 square kilometers, or roughly 700 square miles. That makes it the 18th largest island in the United States. So it's fairly significant in terms of size. And it's got a lot of topographic relief. The highest point is actually 2,500 feet above sea level. Next slide, please, Lauren. Now, historically, the island was dominated by this species. These are large old stands of Sitka spruce. You can still see plenty of them on the island. They're an incredibly complex habitat, and I'll return to that in a moment. And this really represents the keystone species for all of the ecosystem complexities that this island can demonstrate. Next slide, please, Lauren. So there are many interesting species to see here. They're readily available. There are bald eagles, brown bears, elk, whales, salmon, and sea otters, to name a few. All these organisms are readily easy to see on the island. They're quite abundant, but they're in decline, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But I want to emphasize first the importance of how complex and how integrated this ecosystem is. Go to the next slide, please, Lauren. So what this heuristic shows you here are some of the organisms and their interaction that occur on Afognak Island. If we start with the trees themselves, an intact forest supplies many benefits to the local community of the various organisms that live within it and around it. So the trees, for example, supply fresh water to the local streams, which salmon need, the anadromous salmon need, in order to reproduce. They provide denning sites for the bears and the wolves that occupy the island. They provide nesting sites for the eagles that are there, cover and protection from inclement weather, and the seeds are harvested by rodents and birds. So the forests themselves are integral to the island and its functioning. The fresh water then is in sufficient quality that at least 3 species of salmon will breed in the rivers on Afognak Island. Those salmon during the breeding season are consumed by bears and by eagles and wolves. Now, what's interesting about this is not only is it a food source that's used for bears to overwinter to build up a fat supply, but when these salmon are carried into the woods or onto the bank, the remains that are left will decompose. And there's actually data to show that it acts as a fertilizer for tree growth, and that Sitka spruce grow better along the shores of the streams than they do in the interior, away from the streams. So the idea here is that this is a fully integrated ecosystem, that it's intertwined and that each organism is dependent on another in one way or another. Can you go to the next slide, please, Lauren? So here's the problem. There's extensive logging on Afognak Island, and what you're seeing here is a part of the island that's been logged over several decades. So there are some existing stands. You can see those as the darker areas, but there are lots of light areas. Those areas were logged previously and they're not regenerating. So the logging companies were not in the habit of replanting these areas. And as a consequence, what's happening is the community is changing to a shrub-dominated community. So we're losing our forests here. So based on the heuristic I showed you previously, you can imagine the impact that's going to have on many of the other organisms that inhabit Afognak Island. Next slide, Lauren, please. So we've invoked or instituted a carbon project here on 3,300 hectares. It's adjacent to the north coast on the Paranosa Bay, Delphin Bay area of Afognak. There's a crude map there on the right-hand side. It's an approved forest management project that uses Vera's VM12 methodology. So it's all about avoided harvesting. So the idea is to conserve the forest that's left in order to try to maintain these ecosystems. The project's been running since about 2006, and it will run through 2035. So ClimeCo has taken over this project now. We manage the project and we market the credits from it. Next slide, please, Lauren. So now I'm going to return to the same slide that Lauren showed you, but now with a little different emphasis. It's on the nature-based side. So why would buyers like nature-based projects? Well, what I've tried to emphasize to you is the co-benefits of these projects. There's a lot to them besides just the carbon. They're significant and they're positive, and they have impacts on the local community as well as biodiversity. Some of our buyers like the types of reduction. Certain SBS projects remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere. That would be mostly our regenerative projects, so our restoration projects in the lower Mississippi, for example. Afognac's a conservation-based project. So most of what we're doing there is preserving or maintaining the carbon that's already on the land and avoid the emissions associated with harvesting. But there are trade-offs to NBS projects. Buyers may not like the fact that they're not as permanent as our industrial-based projects. Physical storage means there's a risk of reversal. Forest fire and disease are ongoing issues that we always need to be aware of. Measurability can be a problem. As I mentioned earlier, certain projects use counterfactual baselines, and those counterfactuals can never be established with 100% certainty. And so for some buyers, that's a concern and a risk they may or may not want to take. But for many buyers, it's the story that's important. And so that's the real attraction in our NBS program. And we do our best to make sure that our projects are of the highest integrity so that buyers can be very much aware of the story they can tell with the credits that they buy. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Derek, who's going to wrap up our talk.
Thanks, Clive. Well, I do want to leave a lot of time for questions from the audience, but I guess I would like to wrap up and say just a couple of quick things. I think we heard today from Clive and from Lauren, and I'll reiterate that there are many valid opportunities to standardize our market and to improve our market and our processes. And I think that ClimeCo and all of our clients need to be committed to taking that journey every day to try to do better everywhere that we can. However, I still feel very confident that there's a really important role for voluntary carbon offsets. I think that we need to take an all of the above approach when working on tackling the problem of climate change. And I think that it's not okay to say, well, something isn't good enough or we don't want to move on that today. We're too late. We're past time and we need to take action. And offsets provide an awful lot of benefits well beyond the actual ton of emission reductions that we're confident that they achieve. For our clients, I think we advise a couple of things. I think that we let our clients know that like any investment, and an investment in a carbon offset credit, the purchase of one, I do consider it an investment. It's an investment in our future. It's an investment in change and impact. And like any investment, there are risks. Nature-based projects have tremendous positive co-benefits. They also have some permanence risks associated with them. So, buyers have a need to weigh those risks and see what the appropriateness is of them. But that's why we tend to offer a very diversified portfolio of offset credits so that we can kind of meet everyone's needs and approach. And I guess the last thing I would say is we focus a lot at ClimeCo on talking with our clients about what story they'd like to tell. We think about their business, their stakeholders. What do their investors, their board of directors, their customers, their employees, their vendors, what do they care about? What does their supply chain look like? And how can they impact it best? And then we try to build them a harmonized portfolio that meets the story that they're looking to tell to their customers. And it's not just about the number of credits purchased and the number of tons offset, it's about the impact that they hope to have. So we like to craft that story for them. With that, Dustin, are there any audience questions we can address?
Yes, there's a few. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and those of you who decided to submit questions. We appreciate that. I wanted to thank Clive, Derek, and Lauren also for the wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot about the different kinds of projects and why they're important. Let me jump right in with one of our questions here, which is, what is the biggest struggle that you are currently facing in the market?
Derek?
Well, I would like to hear from each of you. What are your perspectives on that with respect to industrial projects and NBS projects?
Sure. I think for industrial projects, there's still some market enablement that needs to happen. So a lot of these projects, because we have such stringent standards on specific measurement and specification, it often requires making new methodologies and documentation, and there's a long lead time for that. So a project type that's really exciting that comes to me today, it might take 2 years before we can create the methods to support it. So I think those lead times are difficult.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think the biggest struggle I see is in the level of education that we need to instill in both the technical and non-technical side. We've probably most, if not everyone on this call, is aware of some of the negative press that we've received around NBS projects of late. I've got strong opinions about that I don't have time to articulate, but I will say that what I have not seen is a good rebuttal in some cases from individuals who don't have a conflict of interest, that I would put myself in that category, wherein I don't see non-technical people with the ability to evaluate some of the criticism that they're seeing. And that's unfortunate because it leaves it to us to have to defend that, to have to point out where the inconsistencies are in the analyses and approaches. And it detracts from the message in that sense. So for me, what I'd like to see is more education. We need to do a better job of demonstrating to people what these projects represent, how important they are, and why we need to continue investing in them. And I will finish by saying that I'll say one thing. So when those criticisms came down, I did feel actually a sense of satisfaction from hearing them, believe it or not. And that was because it demonstrated to me how far we've come since I first started in this game, which was almost 2 decades ago. I remember my first presentations to an oil and gas group, and the questions they were asking me were really around what and why. So what should I be doing and why? And now the question is much more around how are we doing this? So the emphasis has changed now. People recognize we're doing something useful, I hope, but others are saying it's not good enough, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't have to be perfect at this point. I recognize that, and there are lots of reasons why it isn't. But we need to educate people so they can draw their own conclusions along those lines.
I agree. I really like that point, Clive. I think the last 2 or 3 years for me has been a bit of an epiphany. It's been nice to receive criticisms because you feel like people are paying attention. They're accepting that this activity is happening, that it's important, and then they're just questioning the way in which it's being done. And that's extremely positive. I like that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We can move on to another question here, which is, how does the voluntary carbon market fit into a company's ESG strategy?
I can chip in on that one a little bit. I think that increasingly companies are realizing that that an ESG strategy is not just reporting on their specific impacts. It's really creating a target, a set of goals, a pathway, a plan, whatever they'd like to call it, for where they want to get to. And voluntary offsets and supporting projects is one piece of that plan. ClimeCo doesn't in any way think it should be all of the plan. We think that internal reductions are extremely important, and there has to be a pathway to getting closer to zero over some credible period of time. Internally, offsets are an important piece. Another important piece that we're focusing on right now is something that we kind of term insetting, which is taking a look at a company's supply chain, up and down the supply chain, and seeing how they can be a participant in improving the total impact of their products or services across the supply chain. So working with a vendor, working with a a base material manufacturer to improve things in the in the overall product or service profile is important too.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Derek. I have another question maybe for Clive here, which is, can anyone create a nature-based project?
Technically, yes. In practical terms, probably not. And that's a little bit self-serving, but I think that's the reality of it. They are technically complicated. We have an entire team. We have an expert technical team that I rely on to give us the kinds of numbers that we need to understand whether a carbon project can be implemented. But there's a lot more to it than that. If you think about the criticisms and the issues that I raised earlier, those need to be addressed in every single project. So it's important to understand what those issues are, and then you need to know how to address them so that we don't commit the same errors over and over again. I'm happy to say that thus far, touch wood, none of our projects, I would say, have really received any serious negative scrutiny, and I intend to continue with that going forward. But certainly, I would say in principle you can, but in practice, no.
I think, Clive, I agree with that. I might add, though, that there's some practical realities. Nature-based projects are extremely expensive to manage. The payment of the third-party verification, the payment of registry fees and costs, any of the sampling that's required. So there's kind of an economical property size that's required it's a little bit challenging to achieve.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We have time for one or two more questions here. This one I know is something that we've touched on a little bit before, but just what defines the term high quality in regard to the VCM?
Hopefully the presentation helped answer that a bit, but
Mm-hmm.
I think when we talk about, I think one thing to know is that qualities might be different for every different project type. So I think when I look at a project, the measurability, the durability of the project is really important, especially when we're looking into the industrial space, because that's not just possible, but kind of industry standard. I would say a lot of these companies are very comfortable with this level of measurement and rigor. So knowing that the emission reduction that you've made is truly reduced forever is a big quality benchmark for me.
Yeah, on the NBS side, it's making sure that the methodologies that are underpin the project are followed, and to make sure that you're actually doing something that's conservative in the sense that there's no gaming with the baseline. That's critically important. And then associating those co-benefits with a project. We really emphasize co-benefits heavily in our projects, sometimes because our clients want the co-benefits and the carbon's a way to get to them. But in other cases, no, not. It's the carbon that's driving, and then we develop the co-benefits. But certainly for me, that's what constitutes a quality project.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I think we have time for just one more. Another question here. How can I learn more about carbon credits and how they're created? And I'll actually field this one. We have a wonderful 4-part editorial series on the ClimeCo website that we have gone through, and a lot of the topics that were discussed in this presentation are in there. And if you'd like to read more about nature-based projects and industrial projects and why they're important to have a harmonized portfolio, that's on the ClimeCo website right there waiting for you. And shortly joining that will be this recording from this presentation. So if you happen to join late, or you want to see certain portions of it again, we'll have the recording of this presentation on the website along with the slide deck that you are able to look at again. So I want to thank Clive Welham again, our Vice President for Nature-Based Services, Lauren Mechak, our Senior Director for Asset Innovations, and of course, Derek Six, our Chief Operating Officer here at ClimeCo. So thank you, everybody, for your great presentation, and everyone who joined us today and asked these questions. We appreciate you taking an hour out of your day today to be with us. So check the ClimeCo site and we'll have this information up again for you there. So, all right, I think everyone have a wonderful day, and we'll do this again soon with another topic. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Dustin.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.